The mist rolls across Britain's ancient hills, carrying echoes from a world where oak trees were sacred and forests could feel like living cathedrals. In this episode, we uncover the full story of the Druids, the elusive priests, teachers, and judges who shaped Celtic society for centuries, long before they were reduced to Roman rumours and later legend. 2,000 years ago, in a moonlit clearing, robed figures moved between towering oaks while their chants blended with the wind. They were not just mystics. Druids were guardians of knowledge, including astronomy and medicine, law and ritual, history, and the unwritten rules that held communities together. And their origins do not begin with the Romans who feared them, but much earlier, in the Bronze Age haze of prehistoric Europe, as Celtic cultures spread and transformed across the continent. Even the word Druid points to what mattered most. It likely traces back to ancient Celtic roots connected to oak and knowledge, or to firm and true knowledge. The oak stood at the centre of their symbolic world, with deep roots below and wide branches above, linking the underworld, the earth, and the sky. But to understand the Druids, we first need to understand the world that produced them. If you enjoyed this and want more stories like this to fall asleep to, please like the video and subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Around 1200 BCE, as the Bronze Age collapsed across Europe and iron began to replace bronze in tools and weapons, a new culture emerged from the archaeological shadows. The Hallstatt culture, named after an Austrian archaeological site, represented the earliest phase of Celtic civilization. These people possessed advanced ironworking skills, sophisticated artistic traditions, and most importantly, a complex religious system that would eventually give birth to the Druidic tradition. The archaeological evidence from this period reveals a society deeply concerned with the sacred landscape. Hill forts crowned strategic heights, their ramparts enclosing not just defensive positions, but sacred spaces where religious ceremonies took place. Votive deposits in rivers, lakes, and bogs suggest elaborate ritual practices involving the offering of precious objects to divine powers associated with water and earth. The Latène culture, emerging around 450 BCE, marked the height of Celtic artistic and spiritual achievement. Named after a site on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland, this culture produced the intricate metalwork and distinctive artistic style we associate with Celtic civilization. More importantly, it was during this period that Druidic practices reached their full development, spreading across Celtic territories from Ireland to Asia Minor. But who were these mysterious figures who commanded such respect and fear among both Celts and Romans? The Druids formed the intellectual and spiritual elite of Celtic society, serving simultaneously as priests, judges, teachers, healers, and advisors to kings. Unlike the hereditary priesthoods of other ancient cultures, Druidism required decades of intensive training and memorization. Young candidates spent up to 20 years learning the oral traditions that preserved Celtic lore, mythology, astronomy, medicine, and religious practice. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder described their most famous ritual, the cutting of mistletoe from sacred oak trees using a golden sickle while wearing white robes. This ceremony, performed on the 6th day after the new moon, demonstrates the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that underpinned Druidic practice. The mistletoe, remaining green when the oak lost its leaves, symbolized eternal life and divine power, making it the most potent of magical plants. Caesar's observations, though filtered through Roman political prejudices, provide our most detailed contemporary account of Druidic society. He noted that the Druids claimed descent from the god Dispater, the Celtic equivalent of Pluto, ruler of the underworld. This divine ancestry explained their authority over matters of life and death, their role in conducting human sacrifice, and their supposed ability to communicate with the spirits of the deceased. The Druids maintained no written records, preserving their vast knowledge through oral tradition alone. This practice, which Caesar attributed to their desire to keep sacred knowledge from the common people and to strengthen memory through constant recitation, had profound implications for Celtic culture. Without written texts, the Druids themselves became living libraries, repositories of lore, genealogy, medical knowledge, and religious wisdom that took decades to master fully. Their educational systems centered on sacred groves throughout the Celtic world, with the most prestigious school located in the forests of what is now central France. Students travelled from across Celtic territories to study at these forest universities, learning not just religious doctrine, but practical skills in astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and law. The curriculum included memorizing hundreds of verses containing legal precedents, mythological narratives, astronomical calculations, and pharmacological knowledge. Archaeological evidence from sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde in France reveals the physical reality of Druidic religious practice. These sacred enclosures, surrounded by wooden palisades and containing ritual shafts filled with sacrificial offerings, demonstrate the sophisticated ceremonial architecture that supported Druidic worship. Deposits of weapons, jewelry, animal bones, and human remains suggest complex rituals designed to maintain cosmic balance and ensure divine favor. The Druids possessed remarkable astronomical knowledge, evidenced by sites like the Coligny calendar, a bronze tablet discovered in France that records a sophisticated lunar-solar calendar system. This calendar, inscribed in Gaulish using Latin letters, demonstrates the mathematical precision with which Druids tracked celestial cycles and calculated the timing of religious festivals. The calendar's complexity rivals contemporary Mediterranean systems while maintaining distinctively Celtic features. Their medical knowledge, preserved in later Irish and Welsh manuscripts, reveals a sophisticated understanding of herbal medicine and surgical techniques. Druids served as the primary healers in Celtic society, treating everything from battlefield wounds to chronic diseases using plant-based remedies, ritual procedures, and what we might today recognize as psychosomatic treatments that addressed both physical and spiritual ailments. The legal authority of the Druids extended throughout Celtic society, from settling disputes between neighbours to advising kings on matters of war and peace. They maintained detailed knowledge of precedent and custom, serving as living embodiments of Celtic law. Their judgments carried religious authority, backed by their power to exclude offenders from religious ceremonies, effectively cutting them off from Celtic society and spiritual protection. The political influence of the Druids reached its zenith during the late Iron Age, when they served as advisors to Celtic kings and warriors preparing to resist Roman expansion. Archaeological evidence from sites like Bibracte in France shows Druids actively involved in the political and military decisions that shaped Celtic responses to Roman invasion. Their role in organizing resistance movements would ultimately contribute to Roman determination to eliminate them entirely. The sacred landscape of the Celts reflected Druidic cosmology, with natural features like springs, groves, and hilltops serving as focal points for religious activity. Rivers held particular significance, viewed as boundaries between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The Thames, Seine, and Rhine all received elaborate votive deposits during the Celtic period, suggesting that major waterways served as sites for ceremonies conducted by Druids, seeking divine intervention or expressing gratitude for divine favour. The seasonal festivals that structured Celtic religious life demonstrate the Druids' sophisticated understanding of agricultural and astronomical cycles. Samhain, marking the beginning of winter, opened the boundaries between worlds and allowed communication with ancestral spirits. Imbolc celebrated the returning light and the beginning of the pastoral year. Beltane marked the start of summer and the season of growth and fertility. Lugnasad honoured the first harvest and the god Love's sacrifice for his people. These festivals required extensive preparation and coordination across Celtic territories, demonstrating the organisational capabilities of the Druidic hierarchy. The uniformity of ritual practices across the Celtic world, from Ireland to Galatia, suggests a sophisticated network of communication and shared training that maintained religious coherence despite political fragmentation. The Druids' reputation for human sacrifice, emphasized by Roman authors for political purposes, must be understood within the context of Celtic religious belief and practice. Archaeological evidence confirms that ritual killing occurred at certain sacred sites, but these practices appear to have been highly regulated ceremonial activities rather than the random brutality described by hostile Roman sources. The victims, often warriors or high-status individuals, may have been volunteers seeking divine transformation, or criminals whose deaths served to restore cosmic balance. Their prophetic abilities, celebrated in Celtic literature and feared by Roman generals, reflected sophisticated techniques for gathering and interpreting information rather than supernatural powers. Druids maintained networks of informants throughout Celtic territories, allowing them to predict political developments and military movements with uncanny accuracy. Their reputation for prophecy enhanced their political influence while providing practical intelligence that aided Celtic resistance to Roman expansion. The material culture associated with Druidic practice reveals the wealth and status these religious specialists commanded within Celtic society. Elaborate bronze cauldrons, ornate metalwork, and precious jewellery found in ritual contexts demonstrate the resources Celtic communities devoted to maintaining their religious institutions. The famous Gundestrup cauldron, discovered in Denmark but probably manufactured in the Celtic world, depicts complex mythological scenes that may illustrate Druidic teachings about divine transformation and spiritual journey. As we drift deeper into this ancient world, the next chapter of our story awaits, where we will explore how the Druids adapted their practices across different Celtic regions, developed their sophisticated philosophical systems, and created the cultural foundations that would influence European thought for centuries to come. The diversity of Celtic territories across Europe created fascinating variations in Druidic practice, each region adapting core traditions to local conditions while maintaining essential spiritual unity. In the windswept islands of Britain, Druids developed unique relationships with the sea and coastal environments that shaped their astronomical observations and ritual calendars. The tidal rhythms became integral to their ceremonial timing, with certain rites performed only during specific combinations of lunar phases and tidal movements. Irish Druids, isolated by geography from continental influences, preserved some of the most archaic forms of Celtic spirituality. Their sacred sites often incorporated natural rock formations and caves that served as portals to the otherworld. The famous passage tomb at Newgrange, built millennia before the Druids yet incorporated into their religious system, demonstrates how these priests adapted prehistoric monuments to serve their evolving spiritual needs. The tomb's precise solar alignment, illuminating the inner chamber only during the winter solstice, reflects the sophisticated astronomical knowledge that characterized mature Druidic practice. Continental Druids in Gaul faced different challenges and opportunities, developing practices that reflected their position at the crossroads of European trade routes. Their sacred groves near major rivers served not only as religious centres, but as neutral meeting places where tribes could conduct diplomacy and commerce under divine protection. The Druids' role as guarantors of sacred hospitality made them essential to the economic networks that connected Celtic communities across vast distances. The philosophical systems developed by these ancient intellectuals rivaled anything produced by contemporary Mediterranean thinkers. Celtic cosmology envisioned a universe structured around the sacred number 3, with existence divided between the land of the living, the otherworld of spirits and deities, and the realm of ancestors. This tripartite division influenced everything from legal procedures to artistic expression, creating a coherent worldview that integrated spiritual belief with practical governance. Their understanding of time differed radically from linear Mediterranean concepts, embracing instead a cyclical vision where past, present, and future interpenetrated in complex patterns. This temporal philosophy influenced their approach to prophecy, which they understood not as predicting fixed futures, but as recognizing recurring patterns in the great wheel of existence. Events echoed across generations, with heroes and villains playing out eternal dramas in ever-changing forms. The Druidic concept of the soul involved multiple components that survived bodily death in different ways. They taught that the life force, called anam in later Irish sources, journeyed through various states of existence before returning to earthly incarnation. This belief in transmigration influenced their fearless approach to death, which Roman observers noted with both admiration and bewilderment. Celtic warriors, instructed by their Druids, faced battle with supernatural courage because death represented transformation rather than termination. Their educational methodology employed sophisticated memory techniques that modern cognitive science has only recently begun to understand. Students learned vast bodies of information by associating facts with specific locations in familiar landscapes, creating mental maps where each hill, grove, and stream held particular knowledge. This system, known today as the method of loci, allowed Druids to recall thousands of legal precedents, genealogies, and ritual procedures with perfect accuracy. The sacred architecture of Celtic religion reflected Druidic understanding of cosmic geometry and divine proportion. Stone circles, timber henges, and hill fort layouts followed mathematical principles that created spaces resonant with spiritual power. These sites functioned as three-dimensional calendars, with alignments marking not only solar and lunar events, but the rising and setting of significant stars and planets. The Druids understood architecture as a form of prayer made manifest in stone and timber. Medical practice among the Druids integrated physical healing with spiritual purification in ways that anticipated modern holistic approaches to health. They recognized connections between emotional states and physical symptoms, treating diseases as disruptions in the patient's relationship with the natural world. Their pharmacopoeia included hundreds of plant preparations, each associated with specific deities and requiring particular ritual protocols for effective use. The legal codes preserved by Druids reflected sophisticated understanding of social psychology and conflict resolution. Celtic law emphasized restoration over punishment, seeking to heal communities damaged by crime rather than simply deterring future offenses. The complex system of compensation and ritual purification they developed served to reintegrate offenders into society while providing meaningful justice for victims and their families. Their astronomical observations extended far beyond practical calendar keeping to encompass sophisticated cosmological theories about the structure and fate of the universe. Druids tracked the movements of planets they associated with various deities, recognizing patterns that influenced both individual destinies and collective events. Their star maps, preserved in later Celtic manuscripts, reveal detailed knowledge of stellar positions and movements that rivals contemporary Mesopotamian astronomy. The artistic traditions fostered under Druidic patronage produced some of Europe's most distinctive and influential decorative styles. The intricate interlaced patterns, spiral motifs, and zoomorphic designs that characterize Celtic art encoded spiritual meanings understood by initiates while providing aesthetic pleasure for ordinary viewers. Every curve and intersection carried symbolic significance, creating artworks that functioned simultaneously as decoration, religious instruction, and magical protection. Trade relationships maintained by Celtic communities under Druidic guidance extended from the Atlantic to the Black Sea, creating networks that transmitted not only goods, but ideas, techniques, and spiritual practices. Druids served as cultural ambassadors, facilitating exchanges between Celtic tribes and foreign peoples, while ensuring that external influences were properly integrated into Celtic spiritual frameworks. The seasonal migrations of Celtic peoples followed routes blessed by Druids, and marked by sacred sites that provided spiritual sustenance during long journeys. These movement patterns, dictated by pastoral needs and trading opportunities, created a dynamic religious landscape where portable rituals complemented fixed sacred places. Druids developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining spiritual connection to home territories while traveling, ensuring that Celtic identity remained strong despite geographical mobility. Their understanding of gender roles in spiritual practice differed significantly from Mediterranean norms, with women playing prominent roles in religious hierarchy and magical practice. Female druids, known as bandrui in Irish sources, possessed equal authority with their male counterparts in matters of law, prophecy, and ritual performance. This gender equality reflected broader Celtic attitudes about the complementary nature of masculine and feminine spiritual principles. The coming storm of Roman conquest would soon test every aspect of this remarkable civilization. But for now, in the peaceful groves and sacred clearings of Celtic Europe, the Druids continued their ancient work of maintaining the delicate balance between human society and the divine forces that governed the natural world. The Roman conquest of Celtic territories marked not merely a military campaign, but a profound clash between two incompatible worldviews that would reshape the spiritual landscape of Europe forever. Julius Caesar's legions carried more than weapons and siege engines into Gaul. They brought a vision of civilization that left no room for the ancient wisdom of the sacred groves. The systematic destruction of Druidic institutions that followed represents one of history's most deliberate attempts to eradicate an entire intellectual tradition. Caesar himself recognized the Druids as the most dangerous obstacle to Roman dominion, understanding that their authority transcended tribal boundaries and political allegiances. These priests commanded loyalty that no Celtic king could match, their words carrying divine sanction that made compromise with Roman rule spiritually impossible. The proconsul's commentaries reveal not just military strategy, but cultural warfare designed to sever the spiritual roots that nourished Celtic resistance. The first systematic persecution began in 54 BCE, when Caesar ordered the destruction of sacred groves throughout conquered Gaul. Roman soldiers, initially reluctant to defile what they recognized as holy places, were forced by their commanders to cut down ancient oaks and burn the wooden temples that had served Celtic communities for centuries. The psychological impact of these acts extended far beyond their immediate military value, demonstrating Roman power to violate the most sacred taboos of Celtic religion. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the sudden abandonment of ritual sites that had functioned continuously for generations. At Gournay-sur-Aronde, excavations show clear evidence of deliberate destruction followed by Roman military occupation. The careful burial of sacred objects by fleeing priests suggests desperate attempts to preserve religious artifacts for future restoration that would never come. The execution of captured Druids became a standard Roman practice, designed not just to eliminate individual opponents, but to terrorize entire communities into submission. Caesar's accounts describe public executions conducted with maximum brutality, intended to demonstrate that Celtic gods could not protect their servants from Roman justice. These spectacles served dual purposes, eliminating spiritual leadership while providing object lessons in the futility of resistance. Surviving Druids faced impossible choices as Roman authority consolidated throughout Gaul. Some fled to unconquered territories in Britain and Ireland, carrying with them whatever fragments of tradition they could preserve. Others went underground, maintaining secret schools in remote forests where students could still learn abbreviated versions of ancient lore. A few collaborated with Roman authorities, adapting their practices to serve new masters while hoping to preserve essential elements of Celtic spirituality. The transformation of Celtic religion under Roman rule followed predictable patterns of cultural assimilation and syncretism. Roman administrators, recognizing the impossibility of completely eliminating indigenous beliefs, encouraged the identification of Celtic deities with Roman equivalents. Lugh became Mercury, Brigid merged with Minerva, and Cernunnos assumed attributes of Bacchus in elaborate theological compromises that satisfied political requirements while gutting spiritual authenticity. These syncretic adaptations satisfied neither traditional Celts nor Roman purists, creating hybrid religious systems that lacked the coherence of their predecessors. The elaborate rituals that had connected Celtic communities to their landscape were replaced by standardized Roman ceremonies that emphasized imperial loyalty over spiritual authenticity. The sacred groves that had served as universities and law courts became recreational parks where Roman colonists could enjoy sanitized versions of exotic local customs. The island of Anglesey off the Welsh coast became the final stronghold of traditional Druidism, its isolation providing temporary refuge for priests and students fleeing continental persecution. Roman intelligence reports described the island as a training centre where young Celts from throughout the unconquered territories came to learn traditional arts of war magic and prophecy. The concentration of Druidic authority on Anglesey made it an inevitable target for Roman military attention. Suetonius Paulinus, appointed governor of Britain in 59 CE, recognized that crushing Druidic power required more than scattered persecution. His systematic campaign against Anglesey represented the culmination of Roman efforts to eliminate Celtic spiritual resistance through decisive military action. The preparations for this assault involved not just tactical planning, but psychological warfare designed to break Celtic morale before the first sword was drawn. Roman propaganda preceding the Anglesey campaign emphasized the barbaric nature of Druidic practices, particularly their alleged involvement in human sacrifice. These accusations, while containing elements of truth, were deliberately exaggerated to justify the complete destruction of Celtic religious institutions. The Romans understood that civilized warfare required moral justification, especially when targeting priests and sacred sites that commanded widespread respect, even among enemies. The crossing to Anglesey in 60 CE became one of the most symbolically significant military operations in Roman history. Tacitus describes Roman soldiers' initial terror at the sight of Druidic defenders, women dressed as furies carrying torches, while priests invoked curses upon the invading army. The psychological impact of this confrontation worked both ways, with Celtic defenders recognizing that defeat would mean the complete extinction of their ancient traditions. The battle for Anglesey lasted only hours, but its consequences echoed through centuries of European history. Roman discipline overcame Celtic desperation, and the systematic slaughter that followed eliminated the last organized center of Druidic resistance. The sacred groves were burned, the stone circles demolished, and the libraries of oral tradition destroyed along with their human repositories. Survivors of the massacre faced a world where their ancient skills had become not just useless, but dangerous. The few Druids who escaped to Ireland found themselves in territories that would soon face their own Roman invasions. Those who remained in conquered Britain were forced to abandon their religious identity entirely, becoming wandering storytellers, herb gatherers, or simple farmers who kept fragments of ancient knowledge alive in folk customs and seasonal celebrations. The suppression of Druidic institutions created a spiritual vacuum that Roman religion proved inadequate to fill. The elaborate state ceremonies and imperial cults that replaced Celtic practices addressed political needs but failed to provide the deep connection to landscape and season that had sustained Celtic communities for centuries. This spiritual emptiness would eventually contribute to the rapid spread of Christianity throughout former Celtic territories. The transformation of former Druids into Christian monks represents one of history's great ironies, as the intellectual traditions that Rome had tried to destroy found new expression within the very religion that would ultimately replace Roman paganism. Irish monasteries became repositories for classical learning that Roman institutions had abandoned, while Welsh and Breton monks preserved fragments of Celtic lore within Christian frameworks. The legendary figure of Merlin embodies this cultural transformation, representing the evolution of druidic wisdom within Christianized Celtic society. The Wizard of Arthurian romance combines traditional Celtic shamanic elements with Christian mysticism and classical learning, creating a composite figure that satisfied medieval audiences while preserving echoes of pre-Christian spiritual authority. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the extent of Roman efforts to eradicate druidic influence throughout conquered territories. Recent excavations at sites across Britain and Gaul show evidence of systematic destruction, followed by Roman reconstruction, designed to obliterate all traces of previous religious use. The thoroughness of this cultural cleansing explains why so little direct evidence of druidic practice survived into historical periods. The few contemporary accounts of druidic persecution come exclusively from Roman sources, creating significant challenges for modern historians attempting to understand Celtic perspectives on these events. The silence of Celtic voices in historical records reflects not just the destruction of their institutions, but the systematic elimination of their literacy traditions and the individuals who maintained them. The influence of druidic persecution extended beyond immediate military and religious consequences to reshape fundamental patterns of European cultural development. The elimination of Celtic intellectual traditions removed indigenous alternatives to Mediterranean learning, creating conditions that would favour the spread of Christianity and classical culture throughout northwestern Europe. The memory of druidic persecution lived on in Celtic folk traditions long after the institutions themselves had vanished. Stories of hidden treasures, sleeping heroes, and prophesied returns encoded historical memories of spiritual resistance within frameworks that could survive under foreign rule. These narrative traditions would eventually influence medieval literature and modern Celtic revival movements. The Roman campaign against the Druids succeeded so completely that within a century of the Anglesey massacre, accurate knowledge of their practices had largely disappeared even from Celtic communities. The fragments preserved in later Irish and Welsh manuscripts represent not continuous traditions, but reconstructed memories filtered through Christian interpretation and Romantic imagination. As the last flames died on Anglesey and the sacred groves fell silent across Celtic Europe, an ancient world ended forever. Yet from these ashes would emerge new forms of wisdom and spiritual seeking that would carry forward essential elements of druidic insight into the medieval world and beyond, ensuring that their legacy would endure, even as their institutions crumbled into forgotten ruins. The scattered survivors of Anglesey carried more than just their lives into exile. They bore the weight of an entire civilization's knowledge compressed into fragile human memory. In the hills of Wales and the remote valleys of Scotland, former Druids faced the agonizing task of preserving what remained of their traditions while adapting to a world that no longer had place for their ancient calling. The oral libraries that had once required 20 years to master now existed only in fragments scattered across individual minds that might die at any moment without passing on their precious cargo. Some refugees found sanctuary in the monasteries that began appearing throughout Celtic lands, where Christian abbots recognized the value of their learning despite theological differences. These former Druids brought with them not just botanical knowledge and astronomical observations, but sophisticated techniques for memorization and teaching that would profoundly influence monastic education. The great scriptoriums of Ireland and Wales owe much to Druidic methods, though the content they preserved shifted from pagan mythology to Christian theology. The transition from oral to written culture marked perhaps the most fundamental change in how Celtic knowledge was transmitted and preserved. Druids who had spent decades perfecting their memory techniques now watched as monks committed their traditions to vellum and parchment, transforming living wisdom into fixed texts. This transformation saved many elements of Celtic culture from complete extinction, but it also changed their essential nature, converting dynamic oral performances into static literary artifacts. The integration of Druidic healing traditions into medieval medicine created fascinating hybrid practices that combined empirical botanical knowledge with Christian prayer and classical medical theory. Former Druids working as monastery physicians developed comprehensive herbals that preserved detailed knowledge of plant properties while reframing their use within Christian theological contexts. The sacred associations that had once connected specific plants to Celtic deities were replaced with Christian symbolism, but the practical applications remained largely intact. In Ireland, the absence of Roman conquest allowed for a more gradual transformation of druidic institutions rather than their violent destruction. Irish Druids had more time to adapt their practices to changing circumstances, leading to unique developments that preserved more authentic elements of pre-Christian Celtic spirituality. The famous law schools of medieval Ireland maintained druidic legal traditions for centuries after the conversion to Christianity, creating a remarkable synthesis of pagan jurisprudence and Christian ethics. The figure of the Fillead in Irish society represents this cultural continuity, as these hereditary poets and legal experts inherited many of the social functions previously performed by Druids. Unlike their predecessors, the Fillead worked within a Christian framework, but they maintained the ancient emphasis on memorization, the importance of genealogical knowledge, and the power of words to shape reality. Their training still required years of intensive study, though the curriculum now included Christian theology alongside traditional Celtic learning. The seasonal festivals that had structured Celtic religious life underwent complex transformations as Christian authorities sought to replace pagan celebrations with Christian alternatives. Samhain evolved into All Saints' Day, Imbolc became associated with St. Brigid, and Beltane transformed into May Day celebrations that retained many pre-Christian elements beneath Christian veneer. These adaptations allowed communities to maintain connections to ancient rhythms while satisfying new religious requirements. The sacred landscape of Celtic territories proved more resistant to change than human institutions, with natural features continuing to attract veneration despite official Christian disapproval. Holy wells, sacred groves, and hilltop shrines maintained their spiritual significance for local populations, who simply transferred their devotions from Celtic deities to Christian saints. The persistence of these landscape traditions ensured that essential elements of Druidic cosmology survived even when their institutional framework had been destroyed. Archaeological evidence from early medieval Celtic sites reveals the gradual transformation of sacred spaces rather than their complete abandonment. Former temple sites often became the locations of Christian churches, with builders incorporating stones from ancient monuments into new religious architecture. This practice created physical continuity between old and new religious traditions, while symbolically demonstrating Christianity's triumph over paganism. The development of Celtic Christianity itself shows profound influence from pre-Christian spiritual traditions, creating a distinctive form of the faith that differed significantly from Roman orthodoxy. Celtic monks embraced the natural world in ways that reflected Druidic reverence for the sacred landscape, while their emphasis on learning and scholarship echoed ancient priorities. The illuminated manuscripts produced in Celtic monasteries combined Christian content with artistic styles that drew heavily on pre-Christian Celtic motifs. The survival of Celtic languages provided crucial vehicles for preserving elements of Druidic tradition that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Irish and Welsh remained living languages throughout the medieval period, carrying within their vocabulary and syntax conceptual frameworks that reflected pre-Christian ways of understanding the world. The rich body of medieval Celtic literature preserved in these languages contains numerous echoes of earlier traditions, though often transformed beyond easy recognition. The role of women in post-Roman Celtic society continued to reflect earlier patterns that had distinguished Celtic culture from Mediterranean norms. Female saints in Celtic Christianity often displayed characteristics reminiscent of pre-Christian goddesses, while women continued to play prominent roles in intellectual and spiritual life. The abbesses who governed double monasteries in Ireland and Britain wielded authority that would have been familiar to ancient Bandrui, though exercised within Christian rather than Druidic frameworks. The medical traditions preserved in medieval Celtic manuscripts represent one of the most direct survivals of Druidic knowledge, containing detailed information about plant properties and healing techniques that clearly derived from pre-Christian sources. These texts reveal sophisticated understanding of anatomy, pharmacology, and surgical procedures that had been developed over centuries of practical experience. The integration of this knowledge with Christian healing practices created medical traditions that served Celtic communities throughout the medieval period. The legal codes preserved in early Irish law texts provide remarkable insights into the social values and institutional structures that had characterized Celtic society under Druidic guidance. These laws, though eventually influenced by Christian ethics and Roman legal concepts, retained distinctive features that reflected ancient Celtic approaches to justice and social organization. The emphasis on restoration rather than punishment, the complex systems of compensation, and the recognition of multiple forms of marriage all echo earlier traditions. The astronomical knowledge that had been central to Druidic practice found new expression in medieval Celtic monasteries, where monks continued to track celestial cycles for calculating Easter dates and organizing liturgical calendars. The sophisticated mathematical techniques developed by Druids for predicting lunar and solar events were adapted to serve Christian chronological needs, ensuring that this technical knowledge survived even when its original religious context had been abandoned. The prophetic traditions associated with Druidism transformed into medieval Celtic prophecy cycles that combined authentic historical memories with Christian apocalyptic themes. Figures like the Welsh prophet Myrddin, later transformed into the wizard Merlin, embodied this synthesis of pre-Christian visionary traditions with medieval Christian expectations about divine intervention in human affairs. These prophetic texts preserved elements of Druidic cosmology while adapting them to serve new cultural needs. The bardic schools that flourished in medieval Ireland and Wales maintained many of the educational methods that had characterized Druidic training, requiring students to memorize vast bodies of poetry and legal precedent through intensive oral instruction. These institutions provided continuity with ancient learning traditions while adapting their content to serve Christian society. The graduates of these schools became the cultural gatekeepers who determined which elements of pre-Christian tradition would survive into later periods. The transformation of Celtic society in the centuries following Roman conquest and Christian conversion created a complex cultural palimpsest where ancient traditions survived in modified forms beneath newer institutional frameworks. The Druids themselves had vanished, but their influence continued to shape Celtic intellectual life through the students they had trained and the knowledge they had preserved. This hidden continuity would eventually contribute to later Celtic revival movements that sought to recover authentic elements of pre-Christian spirituality. The maritime connections that had always characterized Celtic culture continued to facilitate the exchange of ideas and traditions between different Celtic regions throughout the medieval period. Monks and scholars travelling between Ireland, Wales, Cornwall and Brittany carried with them not just Christian learning, but also fragments of older traditions that had survived in their respective homelands. These networks of communication helped maintain a sense of shared Celtic identity despite political fragmentation and religious transformation. The artistic traditions fostered in Celtic monasteries drew heavily upon pre-Christian decorative motifs while adapting them to serve Christian purposes. The intricate interlace patterns, spiral designs, and zoomorphic figures that characterize manuscripts like the Book of Kells clearly derive from earlier Celtic artistic traditions, suggesting that former Druids or their students played important roles in developing medieval Celtic art. These visual traditions provided another vehicle for preserving elements of ancient culture within Christian contexts. The seasonal celebrations that continued throughout Celtic territories maintained connections to agricultural and astronomical cycles that had been central to Druidic religious practice. Though officially Christianized, these festivals retained many traditional elements, including special foods, ritual activities, and community gatherings that echoed pre-Christian customs. The persistence of these celebrations ensured that local populations maintained awareness of natural rhythms that had been fundamental to ancient Celtic spirituality. As we follow these threads of continuity and transformation through the early medieval period, we begin to see how the Druidic legacy adapted and survived within new cultural frameworks, ensuring that essential elements of ancient Celtic wisdom would endure to influence later generations of seekers and scholars who would attempt to reconstruct what had been lost in the flames of Anglesey and the sacred groves of Gaul. The medieval chronicles that began appearing across Celtic lands during the 8th and 9th centuries preserve tantalizing fragments of what may be authentic Druidic historical traditions, though filtered through Christian scribal perspectives that transformed their original meanings. These texts, written by monks who often possessed fragmentary knowledge of pre-Christian traditions, attempted to reconcile pagan historical memories with Christian chronology, creating composite narratives that blend authentic Celtic traditions with biblical genealogies and classical historical frameworks. The Lebor Gabala Eren, or Book of Invasions, exemplifies this complex synthesis, presenting Irish origins through successive waves of mythical colonizers whose stories encode genuine historical memories within fantastical narrative frameworks. The text describes the Tuatha Dé Danann as divine beings who possess magical knowledge remarkably similar to abilities attributed to historical druids, including mastery over weather, healing, prophecy, and the ability to transform physical reality through spoken word and ritual action. These medieval compilations reveal persistent folk memories of druidic practices that had survived centuries of cultural transformation, though often in garbled or incomplete forms. References to sacred islands, underwater realms, and otherworld journeys reflect authentic Celtic cosmological concepts that had once formed the foundation of druidic teaching, now preserved within Christian allegorical frameworks that made them acceptable to medieval audiences while maintaining their essential symbolic content. The geographical distribution of these textual traditions across Celtic territories demonstrates remarkable consistency in core mythological themes, suggesting that Druidic teaching had indeed maintained uniform doctrinal content across vast distances and cultural variations. Stories of divine kings, magical cauldrons, and transformative journeys appear in Irish, Welsh, and Breton sources, with variations that reflect local adaptation rather than fundamental differences in underlying spiritual concepts. The legal manuscripts preserved in medieval Irish monasteries contain some of the most direct evidence for the continuation of Druidic institutional practices, including detailed descriptions of judicial procedures, compensation systems, and social hierarchies that clearly derive from pre-Christian Celtic traditions. The Brehon laws, though eventually modified by Christian influence, maintain distinctively Celtic approaches to justice that emphasized restoration and community healing rather than punishment and deterrence. These legal texts reveal sophisticated understanding of social psychology and conflict resolution that reflects the practical wisdom accumulated by Druidic judges over centuries of experience. The complex systems of surety and kinship obligation they describe created social networks that bound Celtic communities together through reciprocal responsibilities that transcended immediate family relationships, ensuring collective stability and mutual support during times of crisis. The medical manuscripts that began appearing in Irish monasteries during the medieval period preserved detailed pharmacological knowledge that clearly derives from Druidic healing traditions, containing precise descriptions of plant properties and preparation methods that had been refined through generations of practical application. These texts reveal the empirical foundations underlying what outsiders had dismissed as mere superstition, demonstrating that Druidic medicine combined careful observation with systematic experimentation. The integration of this traditional healing knowledge with Christian theological frameworks, created hybrid medical practices that addressed both physical and spiritual dimensions of illness in ways that anticipated modern holistic approaches to healthcare. Former Druids working as monastic physicians developed treatment protocols that combined herbal remedies with prayer, dietary modification, and lifestyle counseling, recognizing connections between emotional states and physical symptoms that mainstream medicine would not acknowledge for centuries. The astronomical traditions maintained in Celtic monasteries continued to reflect the sophisticated mathematical knowledge that had characterized Druidic calendar systems, with monks developing complex computational methods for calculating Easter dates that drew upon pre-Christian understanding of lunar and solar cycles. These ecclesiastical calendars preserved essential elements of ancient Celtic time reckoning, while adapting them to serve Christian liturgical requirements. The survival of traditional Irish and Welsh poetic meters in medieval literature provides crucial evidence for the continuation of Druidic educational methods, as these complex verse forms required precisely the kind of intensive memorization training that had characterized ancient Celtic schools. The bardic poetry preserved in medieval manuscripts employs intricate patterns of alliteration, rhyme, and rhythm that could only be mastered through years of disciplined study under expert instruction. These poetic traditions maintain not just technical virtuosity, but also thematic content that encoded historical memories, genealogical information, and cultural values in forms designed for accurate transmission across generations. The poets who created these works served social functions remarkably similar to those performed by ancient Druids, preserving community identity and collective memory while providing entertainment and moral instruction. The development of distinctive Celtic Christian art forms during the medieval period reveals the profound influence of pre-Christian aesthetic traditions that had flourished under Druidic patronage. The illuminated manuscripts produced in scriptoriums across Celtic lands employed decorative motifs and compositional principles that clearly derive from earlier artistic traditions, creating visual languages that combined Christian symbolism with indigenous Celtic design elements. The stone crosses that appeared throughout Celtic territories during the early medieval period provide another form of evidence for the continuation of pre-Christian symbolic traditions within Christian contexts. These monuments often incorporate spirals, interlace patterns, and zoomorphic designs that echo motifs found on pre-Christian Celtic metalwork and stone carving, suggesting that the craftsmen who created them had access to traditional artistic knowledge. The pilgrimage routes that developed throughout Celtic lands during the medieval period often followed paths that had been sacred to pre-Christian populations, connecting holy wells, ancient burial sites, and natural features that had maintained their spiritual significance despite official religious transformation. These Christian pilgrimage networks preserved knowledge of the sacred landscape that had been fundamental to Druidic religious practice. The Hermetic traditions that flourished in Celtic Christianity show particular influence from pre-Christian spiritual practices that had emphasized solitary communion with natural forces and divine powers. Celtic hermits often chose locations for their retreats that had been sacred to earlier populations, establishing continuity with ancient traditions of seeking spiritual insight through direct engagement with the natural world. The monastic schools that became centers of learning throughout Celtic Europe maintained educational methods that reflected Druidic pedagogical traditions, emphasizing memorization, oral recitation, and the integration of practical knowledge with spiritual instruction. These institutions attracted students from across Europe who came to study not just Christian theology, but also the distinctive approaches to scholarship that had developed in Celtic monasteries. The manuscript copying traditions that flourished in these monastic centers preserve not only Christian texts, but also secular materials that contained fragments of pre-Christian Celtic culture. Scribes working in Irish and Welsh monasteries copied classical texts, historical chronicles, and literary works that maintained elements of ancient traditions within frameworks acceptable to Christian authorities. The development of Celtic vernacular literature during the medieval period created new vehicles for preserving pre-Christian cultural content in forms that could survive within Christian society. Epic tales, romantic narratives, and heroic cycles maintained themes and character types that reflected ancient mythological traditions, while adapting them to serve medieval audience expectations. These literary developments ensured that essential elements of Celtic cultural identity survived the transformation from pagan to Christian society, providing foundations for later cultural revival movements that would seek to recover authentic pre-Christian traditions. The medieval texts that preserved these materials became crucial sources for scholars attempting to reconstruct historical Celtic culture during the modern period. The seasonal festivals that continued throughout Celtic territories maintained connections to agricultural and natural cycles that had been central to Druidic religious observance, though their meanings were transformed to conform with Christian theological requirements. These celebrations preserved traditional foods, customs, and community activities that encoded ancient knowledge about optimal timing for agricultural and pastoral activities. The folk customs that survived in rural Celtic communities often contained elements that clearly derived from pre-Christian religious practices, including ritual activities associated with wells, trees, and stone formations that had been sacred to earlier populations. These customs provided channels through which ancient spiritual concepts could survive within Christianized cultural contexts. The trading networks that connected Celtic monasteries with centers of learning throughout Europe facilitated the exchange of ideas and materials that helped preserve Celtic cultural distinctiveness while exposing it to outside influences. These connections ensured that Celtic intellectual traditions remained dynamic and adaptive rather than becoming isolated and stagnant. The linguistic developments that occurred in Celtic languages during the medieval period reflect the complex process of cultural transformation that followed the decline of Druidic institutions. New vocabulary emerged to describe Christian concepts, while older terms acquired modified meanings that reflected changing social and religious circumstances. As the medieval period progressed and new cultural challenges emerged from Viking raids and Norman conquest, the hidden streams of Druidic influence would face fresh tests of their ability to adapt and survive within evolving social and political contexts that would demand new forms of cultural expression and preservation. The Viking longships that appeared along Celtic coasts during the 8th and 9th centuries brought more than just raiders seeking plunder. They carried with them a warrior culture that would profoundly reshape the remnants of Celtic civilization and the hidden streams of Druidic tradition that still flowed beneath Christian surfaces. These Scandinavian seafarers possessed their own rich mythological traditions and sophisticated approaches to poetry, law, and spiritual practice that would interact in complex ways with surviving Celtic cultural elements. The initial terror inspired by Viking raids gave way to more nuanced relationships as Norse settlers established permanent communities throughout Celtic territories. In Ireland, the foundation of cities like Dublin and Cork created new centres of trade and cultural exchange, where Celtic monks found themselves negotiating with pagan warriors who possessed their own bardic traditions and sophisticated understanding of oral culture. These interactions produced fascinating hybrid developments that combined Norse and Celtic elements in unprecedented ways. The scholarly communities that had preserved fragments of Druidic learning faced particular challenges during this period of upheaval, as monastic libraries became prime targets for Viking raiders seeking precious metals and manuscripts that could be sold in continental markets. The destruction of scriptoriums at places like Iona and Clonmacnoise represented not just material losses, but the elimination of irreplaceable repositories of ancient knowledge that had been carefully maintained for generations. Yet this period of apparent cultural catastrophe also created unexpected opportunities for preservation and adaptation. Irish scholars fleeing Viking raids carried their manuscripts and learning to continental monasteries, where they established new centres of Celtic scholarship that would influence European intellectual development for centuries. The Irish monks, who founded schools at places like St. Gall and Rheims, brought with them not just Christian theology, but also distinctive pedagogical methods and scholarly approaches that reflected their unique cultural heritage. The fusion of Celtic and Norse cultural elements produced remarkable literary innovations, particularly in Iceland, where Irish monks and Celtic slaves worked alongside Scandinavian settlers to create new forms of historical writing and mythological narrative. The Icelandic sagas that emerge from this cultural mixing show clear influence from Celtic storytelling traditions, while preserving distinctively Norse approaches to heroic narrative and historical consciousness. The legal traditions that had maintained elements of Druidic jurisprudence faced particular pressure during this period, as Viking settlements operated according to their own customary laws that emphasized different values and social structures. The resulting legal pluralism created complex situations where Celtic, Norse, and emerging Christian legal traditions competed and interacted in ways that transformed all three systems. The astronomical knowledge that Celtic monasteries had preserved from ancient Druidic sources proved valuable to Norse navigators, who recognized the practical utility of Celtic computational methods for calculating seasonal changes and predicting weather patterns. This technical exchange created channels through which traditional Celtic learning could survive by adapting to serve new practical purposes within Norse maritime culture. The medicinal traditions that had been maintained in Celtic monasteries attracted interest from Norse settlers who lacked comparable healing knowledge, leading to hybrid practices that combined Celtic herbal wisdom with Norse approaches to wound treatment and surgical intervention. Former Druids working as monastic physicians found their services increasingly sought after by Viking communities that had initially seemed hostile to all forms of Celtic culture. The artistic traditions that had flourished in Celtic monasteries underwent significant transformation during this period of cultural contact, as Norse artistic motifs and techniques influenced Celtic decorative traditions, while Celtic interlace patterns and zoomorphic designs affected Scandinavian artistic development. The hybrid artistic styles that emerged from these interactions created new visual languages that would influence European art for centuries. The seasonal festivals that had maintained connections to pre-Christian Celtic traditions found new expressions as Norse settlers adapted to local agricultural cycles and natural rhythms. The resulting festival calendars combined elements from both traditions, creating celebrations that served the needs of mixed communities while preserving essential connections to landscape and seasonal change. The trading networks that connected Celtic territories to broader European commerce expanded significantly during the Viking period, as Norse merchants established new routes that linked Celtic communities to markets throughout the North Atlantic and Baltic regions. These commercial connections facilitated cultural exchange, while providing new channels through which traditional Celtic knowledge could spread to distant territories. The emergence of hybrid Celtic-Norse political structures in regions like the Hebrides and the Isle of Man created new contexts for the survival and adaptation of traditional governance practices. The Norse Thing assemblies that established legal and political authority in these territories incorporated elements from Celtic legal traditions, creating composite systems that preserved ancient approaches to community decision-making within new institutional frameworks. The linguistic developments that occurred as Celtic and Norse languages came into contact produced new vocabulary and grammatical structures that reflected the complex cultural negotiations taking place in mixed communities. These linguistic changes preserved elements of both traditions while creating new means of expression that served the needs of increasingly diverse populations. The religious syncretism that developed in areas of intensive Celtic-Norse contact created fascinating hybrid spiritual practices that combined Christian theology with elements from both Celtic and Norse pagan traditions. The resulting religious expressions often preserved ancient Celtic concepts about the sacred landscape and seasonal cycles, while incorporating Norse mythological elements and ritual practices. The educational institutions that survived this period of upheaval adapted their curricula and methods to serve the needs of mixed communities that included students from diverse cultural backgrounds. The monastic schools that had preserved elements of Druidic learning found themselves training Norse converts alongside Celtic Christians, creating new pedagogical challenges that required innovative approaches to cultural transmission. The manuscript traditions that continued during this period show clear evidence of cultural fusion, with scribes incorporating Norse runic elements into Celtic decorative schemes while preserving traditional Celtic textual content. These hybrid manuscripts represent unique attempts to maintain cultural continuity while adapting to changing social and political circumstances. The archaeological evidence from Viking Age Celtic sites reveals the complex material culture that emerged from these cultural interactions, with artifacts showing combinations of Celtic and Norse technological traditions, alongside evidence for continued use of ancient sacred sites by mixed communities. The persistence of ritual deposits at traditional Celtic holy places suggests that essential elements of pre-Christian spiritual practice continued despite surface religious transformation. The migration patterns that characterized this period created new opportunities for cultural preservation, as Celtic populations, displaced by Viking raids, established communities in previously uninhabited territories. These refugee settlements often maintained more traditional cultural practices than established communities that had undergone more intensive cultural transformation. The maritime knowledge that Celtic communities had developed over centuries of coastal living proved valuable to Norse settlers who recognized the practical utility of traditional Celtic understanding of local weather patterns, tidal cycles, and seasonal fishing opportunities. This technical exchange created additional channels through which ancient Celtic knowledge could survive by serving new practical purposes. The craft traditions that had been maintained in Celtic monasteries attracted Norse patrons who valued the sophisticated metalworking, manuscript illumination, and textile production techniques that Celtic artisans had preserved from earlier periods. These commercial relationships provided economic support for cultural preservation while creating new contexts for artistic innovation. The storytelling traditions that had maintained oral connections to pre-Christian Celtic culture found new audiences among Norse settlers who possessed their own rich traditions of oral narrative and poetic composition. The resulting fusion of Celtic and Norse storytelling techniques created new literary forms that would influence European literature for generations. The healing traditions that combined herbal knowledge with spiritual practices attracted followers from both Celtic and Norse communities, creating hybrid medical systems that served diverse populations while preserving essential elements of ancient Celtic therapeutic approaches. These medical traditions provided practical benefits that ensured their continuation, despite cultural and religious transformation. The prophetic traditions that had been associated with Druidic practice found new expression in the mixed Celtic-Norse communities that developed during this period, with seers and wise women serving both cultural groups through techniques that combined elements from both traditions. These hybrid prophetic practices preserved ancient Celtic approaches to divination while incorporating Norse methods of spiritual consultation. The agricultural knowledge that Celtic communities had developed through centuries of adaptation to local environmental conditions proved essential to Norse settlers who needed to establish successful farming operations in unfamiliar territories. This practical exchange created opportunities for traditional Celtic environmental knowledge to survive by serving new economic purposes. As the Viking Age progressed and Norse communities became increasingly integrated into Celtic societies, the cultural boundaries that had initially seemed so distinct began to blur in ways that would create new forms of hybrid identity. The Norman conquest that would soon follow would bring fresh challenges to these evolving cultural arrangements, testing once again the adaptability of traditions that trace their ultimate origins to the sacred groves and ancient wisdom of the Druids. The establishment of Norman rule across Celtic territories during the 11th and 12th centuries introduced yet another layer of cultural complexity to regions that had already experienced centuries of transformation and adaptation. These French-speaking conquerors brought with them continental European approaches to feudalism, law, and religious organization that would profoundly reshape the social contexts within which remnants of ancient Celtic traditions continued to survive. The Norman administrative system that replaced earlier Celtic and Norse governance structures created new challenges for the preservation of traditional legal practices that had maintained elements of Druidic jurisprudence for centuries. The imposition of continental feudal law threatened to eliminate the complex systems of kinship obligation and collective responsibility that had characterized Celtic legal traditions, forcing communities to find new ways of maintaining their distinctive approaches to justice and social organization. The monastic reforms introduced by Norman ecclesiastical authorities sought to bring Celtic Christian institutions into closer conformity with continental European practices, threatening the distinctive educational and scholarly traditions that had preserved elements of pre-Christian Celtic learning. The Cistercian and other reformed monastic orders that established new foundations throughout Celtic territories emphasized different approaches to scholarship and spiritual practice that left little room for the hybrid traditions that had developed in earlier Celtic monasteries. Yet the Norman period also created unexpected opportunities for cultural preservation and development, as the political stability imposed by feudal governance allowed for renewed investment in educational institutions and manuscript production. The cathedral schools and universities that emerged under Norman patronage attracted scholars from throughout Europe who came into contact with the distinctive Celtic intellectual traditions that had survived in modified forms within local monastic communities. The legal scholars who worked to reconcile Norman feudal law with existing Celtic and Norse legal traditions created new synthetic legal systems that preserved essential elements of traditional approaches to justice while adapting them to serve feudal administrative requirements. These legal developments ensured that ancient Celtic concepts about community responsibility and restorative justice would survive within new institutional frameworks. The architectural traditions that developed under Norman patronage incorporated elements from Celtic artistic traditions while introducing new continental European design concepts and construction techniques. The great cathedrals and castles built during this period often featured decorative elements that reflected local artistic traditions, creating hybrid architectural styles that preserved ancient Celtic motifs within new monumental contexts. The literary developments that occurred during the Norman period produced some of the most important preservations of ancient Celtic cultural material, as scribes working under Norman patronage copied and compiled earlier texts that contained fragments of pre-Christian traditions. The great manuscript collections that were assembled during this period, including major Irish and Welsh literary compilations, preserved materials that might otherwise have been lost entirely. The courtly culture that developed around Norman castles and administrative centres created new contexts for the performance of traditional Celtic music, poetry, and storytelling, though these cultural expressions were necessarily adapted to serve the entertainment preferences of Norman audiences. The hybrid cultural forms that emerged from these adaptations preserved essential elements of Celtic artistic traditions while creating new means of cultural expression. The trading relationships that developed under Norman rule connected Celtic territories more closely to continental European commercial networks, creating new opportunities for cultural exchange while providing economic support for traditional craft production. The markets that emerged in Norman towns created demand for the distinctive textiles, metalwork, and other craft products that had been developed within Celtic cultural traditions. The educational institutions that flourished under Norman patronage attracted students from throughout the Celtic world, who came to study not just continental European learning, but also the distinctive scholarly traditions that had been preserved in Celtic monasteries. These schools became centres for the compilation and study of traditional Celtic materials, while also serving as channels for the introduction of new intellectual developments from continental Europe. The religious developments that occurred during the Norman period created new opportunities for the preservation of traditional Celtic spiritual practices within reformed ecclesiastical frameworks. The pilgrimage routes that were established or expanded during this period often incorporated ancient Celtic holy sites, ensuring that these locations would continue to receive veneration even as their religious significance was reinterpreted within new theological contexts. The linguistic changes that occurred as Norman French came into contact with Celtic languages produced new vocabulary and literary forms that reflected the complex cultural negotiations taking place in multilingual communities. These linguistic developments preserved elements of traditional Celtic culture while creating new means of expression that served the needs of increasingly diverse populations. The artistic patronage provided by Norman nobles created new opportunities for Celtic craftsmen to develop their traditional skills while adapting them to serve continental European aesthetic preferences. The hybrid artistic styles that emerged from these cultural interactions preserved ancient Celtic design principles while incorporating new decorative elements and techniques from continental European traditions. The administrative records that were maintained by Norman bureaucrats provide valuable evidence for the continuation of traditional Celtic cultural practices within the new feudal system, documenting everything from seasonal festivals to craft production techniques that had survived from earlier periods. These records preserve information about traditional Celtic culture that would otherwise have been lost to historical memory. The military traditions that developed under Norman rule incorporated elements from Celtic warrior culture while introducing new continental European approaches to warfare and military organization. The hybrid military practices that emerged from these cultural interactions preserve traditional Celtic concepts about warrior honor and community defense, while adapting them to serve feudal military requirements. The agricultural innovations that were introduced under Norman rule built upon traditional Celtic farming techniques, while incorporating new crops and cultivation methods from continental Europe. These agricultural developments preserved ancient Celtic knowledge about local environmental conditions, while creating new opportunities for increased productivity and economic development. The urban development that occurred under Norman rule created new contexts for the preservation and adaptation of traditional Celtic cultural practices, as the towns that grew up around Norman castles and administrative centres attracted populations that included both Norman settlers and Celtic natives. These urban communities developed hybrid cultural practices that served the needs of diverse populations while maintaining connections to traditional Celtic customs. The scholarly exchanges that developed between Norman and Celtic intellectuals created new opportunities for the preservation and study of traditional Celtic learning, as continental European scholars recognized the value of the distinctive educational and intellectual traditions that had been maintained in Celtic monasteries. These scholarly relationships ensured that elements of ancient Celtic culture would continue to influence European intellectual development. The manuscript illumination traditions that flourished under Norman patronage combined continental European artistic techniques with traditional Celtic decorative motifs, creating hybrid artistic styles that preserved ancient Celtic design principles while incorporating new aesthetic elements. These illuminated manuscripts represent some of the finest achievements of medieval Celtic art, while demonstrating the continued vitality of traditional cultural practices. The legal commentaries that were produced during this period to explain the relationships between Norman feudal law and traditional Celtic legal practices preserved detailed information about ancient Celtic approaches to justice and social organization. These legal texts provide crucial evidence for understanding how traditional Celtic culture adapted to survive within new political and social contexts. The festival calendars that were maintained in Norman-ruled territories preserved traditional Celtic seasonal celebrations, while adapting them to conform with continental European religious and social customs. These hybrid festival traditions ensured that essential connections to agricultural cycles and natural rhythms would survive even as their surface expressions were transformed to serve new cultural requirements. As Norman rule consolidated throughout Celtic territories and new cultural syntheses emerged from the complex interactions between Norman, Celtic, and Norse traditions, the hidden streams of ancient druidic influence continued to flow beneath these surface transformations, ensuring that essential elements of ancient Celtic wisdom would survive to influence later periods of cultural development and revival. The consolidation of Norman power throughout Celtic lands during the 12th and 13th centuries created a deceptive stability that masked profound cultural undercurrents still flowing from ancient sources. Beneath the stone walls of newly built castles and the Latin chants of reformed monasteries, traditional knowledge keepers continued their quiet work of preservation and adaptation, ensuring that essential elements of pre-Christian wisdom would survive within evolving social frameworks that seemed increasingly hostile to their ancient heritage. The emergence of hereditary bardic families throughout Ireland and Wales during this period represents one of the most remarkable adaptations of Druidic educational traditions to medieval circumstances. These professional poet-scholars, operating under Norman patronage while maintaining their own internal hierarchies and training systems, created institutional structures that preserved crucial elements of ancient Celtic learning within frameworks acceptable to feudal society. Their schools required students to master not just poetic technique, but also genealogy, law, history, and the complex mythological narratives that encoded cultural memory spanning back to pre-Christian times. The curriculum of these bardic schools demonstrates remarkable continuity with ancient Druidic educational methods, requiring decades of intensive memorization and oral recitation that transformed students into living repositories of cultural knowledge. The intricate verse forms they mastered demanded precisely the kind of mental discipline that had characterized pre-Christian Celtic education, while the content they preserved maintained connections to ancient wisdom traditions through carefully maintained chains of transmission that stretched across centuries of political upheaval. The patronage system that supported these bardic families created fascinating tensions between traditional Celtic cultural values and Norman feudal expectations. Poets who served Norman lords found themselves navigating between ancestral obligations to preserve authentic Celtic traditions and immediate practical needs to satisfy patrons whose cultural preferences had been shaped by continental European influences. The resulting compromises produced hybrid literary forms that maintained essential Celtic content while adapting their presentation to serve medieval audience expectations. The genealogical expertise that remained central to bardic training preserved not just family histories, but complex networks of tribal relationships and territorial claims that encoded ancient Celtic approaches to political organization and social identity. These genealogies, though necessarily adapted to acknowledge Norman political supremacy, maintain memories of pre-Norman power structures and territorial arrangements that would later influence Celtic resistance movements and cultural revival efforts. The legal knowledge preserved within bardic traditions continued to reflect distinctive Celtic approaches to justice and social organization that differed fundamentally from Norman feudal concepts. The complex systems of compensation, surety, and collective responsibility that these poet-lawyers maintained provided alternative models for conflict resolution that emphasized community healing over individual punishment, preserving ancient wisdom about human nature and social dynamics within medieval legal practice. The medical traditions that survived within certain bardic families demonstrate the continuation of sophisticated healing knowledge that clearly derived from pre-Christian Celtic sources. These hereditary physicians maintained detailed understanding of herbal properties, surgical techniques, and diagnostic methods, while developing new approaches that integrated traditional Celtic healing concepts with medical knowledge acquired through contact with continental European and Islamic traditions. The astronomical knowledge that had been fundamental to ancient Druidic practice found new expression in the calendar calculations and seasonal observations that remained essential to bardic training. These poet-scholars continued to track celestial cycles and their relationships to agricultural activities, religious festivals, and optimal timing for various social and political activities, preserving practical applications of ancient Celtic cosmological understanding within medieval cultural contexts. The sacred landscape traditions that had been central to pre-Christian Celtic spirituality survived through the topographical knowledge that remained essential to bardic education. These poet-scholars maintained detailed understanding of the mythological associations and historical significance of natural features throughout Celtic territories, preserving cultural connections to specific places that had been sacred to earlier generations, while adapting their significance to serve Christian theological frameworks. The storytelling techniques that characterize bardic performance preserved sophisticated narrative structures and thematic content that clearly reflected ancient Celtic mythological traditions, though necessarily transformed to avoid explicit conflict with Christian doctrine. The epic tales and romantic narratives that these poets created and transmitted maintained essential elements of pre-Christian Celtic worldview while presenting them within frameworks that satisfied medieval audience expectations and religious requirements. The linguistic expertise that remained central to bardic training preserved not just technical mastery of Celtic languages, but also understanding of the symbolic and magical properties that traditional Celtic culture had attributed to words and names. This linguistic knowledge maintained connections to ancient concepts about the power of speech to influence physical reality, though expressed within poetic and legal contexts that avoided direct challenge to Christian theological authority. The network of relationships that connected bardic families across Celtic territories created channels for cultural transmission that operated independently of political boundaries and religious institutions. These professional connections ensured that traditional knowledge could be shared and preserved even during periods of political instability or ecclesiastical persecution, maintaining cultural coherence across regions that had been politically fragmented by conquest and colonization. The craft knowledge that certain bardic families maintained alongside their poetic and legal expertise preserved technical skills in metalworking, textile production, and other traditional Celtic industries. These hereditary craftsmen combined practical expertise with cultural knowledge, creating objects that served both functional and symbolic purposes while maintaining connections to ancient Celtic aesthetic traditions and spiritual concepts. The musical traditions associated with bardic culture preserved not just entertainment value, but also sophisticated techniques for memorization and cultural transmission that reflected ancient Celtic educational methods. The complex relationships between melody, rhythm, and textual content that characterized traditional Celtic music provided additional channels for preserving cultural knowledge while creating art forms that could attract and maintain audience attention across generations of transmission. The seasonal festivals that continued throughout Celtic territories under Norman rule maintained essential connections to agricultural cycles and natural rhythms while adapting their surface expressions to conform with Christian religious requirements. These celebrations preserved traditional foods, customs, and community activities that encoded ancient knowledge about optimal timing for various activities, while providing occasions for the performance of traditional music, poetry, and storytelling. The pilgrimage traditions that developed or continued during this period often incorporated routes and destinations that had been sacred to pre-Christian Celtic populations, ensuring that knowledge of the sacred landscape would survive even as its religious interpretation was transformed. These Christian pilgrimage networks preserved awareness of natural features and archaeological sites that had been significant to earlier Celtic communities, while providing acceptable reasons for continued veneration of these locations. The manuscript traditions that flourished in certain regions during this period preserved not just contemporary literary works, but also copies of earlier texts that contained fragments of pre-Christian Celtic culture. The scriptoriums that operated under bardic patronage or within sympathetic monastic communities created repositories of traditional knowledge that would prove crucial for later scholars attempting to reconstruct authentic Celtic cultural traditions. The trading relationships that connected Celtic craftsmen with continental European markets created economic incentives for the preservation of traditional production techniques, while also facilitating cultural exchange that influenced the development of hybrid artistic traditions. The distinctive Celtic products that found markets throughout medieval Europe provided economic support for traditional cultural practices, while creating channels for the transmission of Celtic cultural influence to distant regions. The educational exchanges that occurred between Celtic bardic schools and continental European institutions created opportunities for cultural preservation, while also introducing new intellectual influences that enriched traditional Celtic learning. These scholarly relationships ensured that Celtic intellectual traditions remained dynamic and adaptive, rather than becoming isolated and stagnant, while also providing channels through which ancient Celtic knowledge could influence broader European cultural development. The architectural traditions that developed under the patronage of Celticized Norman families often incorporated decorative elements and spatial concepts that reflected traditional Celtic aesthetic preferences and spiritual concepts. These hybrid architectural achievements preserved ancient Celtic understanding of the relationships between built space and natural environment, while adapting traditional design principles to serve new social and religious functions. The agricultural innovations that occurred during this period often built upon traditional Celtic farming techniques while incorporating new crops and cultivation methods that had been developed elsewhere. These agricultural developments preserved ancient Celtic knowledge about local environmental conditions while creating new opportunities for increased productivity that supported larger populations and more complex social organizations. The legal developments that occurred as Norman feudal law encountered established Celtic legal traditions created new synthetic legal systems that preserved essential elements of ancient Celtic approaches to justice while adapting them to serve medieval political requirements. These legal innovations ensured that traditional Celtic concepts about community responsibility and restorative justice would continue to influence European legal development for centuries. The religious syncretism that continued throughout this period created new opportunities for the preservation of traditional Celtic spiritual concepts within Christian theological frameworks that were becoming increasingly sophisticated and tolerant of cultural diversity. The distinctive forms of Celtic Christianity that emerged from these cultural negotiations preserved essential elements of pre-Christian Celtic spirituality while satisfying Orthodox Christian doctrinal requirements. As the medieval period reached its height, and new cultural challenges emerged from increasing contact with continental European civilization, the hidden streams of ancient Celtic wisdom continued to flow through these diverse channels of preservation and adaptation, ensuring that essential elements of Druidic knowledge and Celtic cultural identity would survive to influence the great cultural transformations that would soon reshape European civilization during the Renaissance and early modern periods. The Renaissance winds that swept across Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries carried with them not just renewed interest in classical antiquity, but also unexpected opportunities for the recovery and reinterpretation of Celtic cultural materials that had survived in fragmented forms throughout the medieval period. The humanist scholars who emerged during this cultural awakening possessed both the linguistic skills and historical curiosity necessary to examine Celtic manuscripts with fresh perspectives, leading to discoveries that would fundamentally reshape European understanding of pre-Christian Celtic civilization. The printing revolution that transformed European intellectual life during the late 15th century created unprecedented opportunities for the preservation and dissemination of Celtic cultural materials that had previously existed only in rare manuscript copies. The first printed editions of medieval Irish and Welsh texts made these materials accessible to scholars throughout Europe, who lacked direct access to Celtic manuscript collections, creating new possibilities for comparative analysis and historical reconstruction that would have been impossible during earlier periods. The antiquarian movement that flourished throughout Renaissance Europe included pioneering scholars who recognized the historical significance of Celtic cultural remains and began systematic efforts to collect, preserve, and interpret these materials. These early Celtic scholars, working without the archaeological and linguistic tools that would later become available, nevertheless made crucial contributions to the preservation of traditional knowledge by documenting folk customs, recording oral traditions, and copying manuscripts that might otherwise have been lost to neglect or destruction. The political upheavals that characterised the early modern period, including the English conquest of Ireland and the union of Scottish and English crowns, created both threats and opportunities for Celtic cultural preservation. While centralised monarchical authority sought to eliminate regional cultural distinctions that might support political resistance, the same period witnessed increased scholarly interest in documenting and preserving distinctive regional traditions before they could be completely eliminated by political and cultural homogenization. The religious transformations associated with the Protestant Reformation created complex new contexts for Celtic cultural materials, as reformers sought to eliminate Catholic practices while simultaneously showing interest in pre-Catholic Celtic Christian traditions that might provide historical precedent for reformed religious practices. This selective interest in Celtic Christianity led to increased attention to early Irish and Welsh manuscripts that contained both religious and secular materials, ensuring the preservation of texts that might otherwise have been destroyed during religious conflicts. The development of comparative linguistics during the 17th century provided new tools for understanding the relationships between Celtic languages and their connections to broader Indo-European language families, creating scientific frameworks for analysing Celtic cultural materials that had previously been studied only through literary and historical approaches. These linguistic advances enabled scholars to trace the development of Celtic cultural traditions with greater precision, while also revealing previously unrecognised connections between Celtic and other European cultural traditions. The emergence of rational skepticism during the Enlightenment created both challenges and opportunities for Celtic cultural studies, as scholars began applying critical methods to traditional narratives, while simultaneously developing new appreciation for the sophisticated intellectual achievements of pre-modern cultures. The tension between rationalist critique and romantic appreciation for ancient wisdom would profoundly shape European approaches to Celtic culture throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. The archaeological discoveries that began occurring throughout Celtic territories during the 18th century provided material evidence that could be compared with literary sources, creating new possibilities for understanding the historical development of Celtic civilization. The systematic excavation of ancient sites revealed artifacts and architectural remains that demonstrated the sophistication of pre-Christian Celtic culture, while also providing concrete evidence for evaluating the accuracy of medieval literary sources. The folk revival movements that emerged throughout Europe during the late 18th century created new contexts for the preservation and adaptation of traditional Celtic cultural practices, as educated elites began recognizing the value of peasant customs and oral traditions that had maintained connections to ancient cultural practices. These revival movements often involved romantic idealization of pre-modern life, but they also created practical incentives for documenting and preserving traditional knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to modernization. The national awakening movements that swept through Celtic territories during the 19th century provided powerful political motivations for cultural preservation and revival efforts. As emerging nationalist movements sought to establish distinctive cultural identities that could support claims to political autonomy. The scholarly work undertaken to support these political movements often involved serious attempts to recover authentic elements of ancient Celtic culture, though necessarily filtered through contemporary political and cultural concerns. The development of professional archaeology during the 19th century revolutionized understanding of Celtic material culture by providing systematic methods for excavating and interpreting physical remains from ancient Celtic sites. The application of scientific methods to Celtic archaeological materials revealed evidence for complex social organization, sophisticated technological capabilities, and extensive trade networks that demonstrated the advanced character of pre-Roman Celtic civilization. The linguistic research that flourished during the 19th century created new understanding of the historical development of Celtic languages and their relationships to documented cultural practices. enabling scholars to trace the evolution of Celtic cultural concepts with unprecedented precision. These linguistic advances provided tools for analysing traditional Celtic texts that revealed layers of historical development and cultural change that had been invisible to earlier scholars working without comparative linguistic frameworks. The manuscript discoveries that continued throughout the 19th century provided additional sources for understanding Celtic cultural traditions, as scholars gained access to previously unknown collections of medieval texts that contained fragments of ancient cultural materials. The systematic cataloguing and publication of Celtic manuscript collections made these materials available to international scholarly communities, while also revealing the extent of cultural materials that had survived despite centuries of political and religious transformation. The folk music revival that occurred throughout Celtic territories during the 19th century preserved traditional musical forms that contained elements derived from ancient Celtic cultural practices, creating new opportunities for understanding the aesthetic and spiritual dimensions of pre-Christian Celtic culture. The systematic collection and analysis of traditional Celtic music revealed sophisticated structural principles and thematic content that reflected ancient cultural values and spiritual concepts. The educational reforms that occurred throughout Celtic territories during the 19th century created both threats and opportunities for traditional cultural preservation, as standardized national education systems sought to eliminate regional cultural variations while simultaneously creating literacy skills that enabled local populations to document and preserve their own traditional knowledge. The tension between cultural homogenization and local preservation would characterize Celtic cultural development throughout the modern period. The industrial development that transformed Celtic territories during the 19th century disrupted traditional rural communities that had maintained connections to ancient cultural practices, while also creating new urban contexts where traditional knowledge could be preserved and adapted to serve modern needs. The migration from rural to urban areas often involved the loss of traditional cultural knowledge, but also created opportunities for cultural preservation through the establishment of cultural organizations and educational institutions in urban centers. The transportation improvements that connected previously isolated Celtic communities to broader national and international networks facilitated cultural exchange that both threatened traditional practices and created new opportunities for cultural preservation and revival. The same railroad lines and shipping routes that brought outside cultural influences to remote Celtic communities also enabled local cultural materials to reach wider audiences and gain support from sympathetic scholars and cultural enthusiasts. The democratic political movements that emerged throughout Europe during the 19th century created new opportunities for Celtic cultural expression and preservation, as expanding political participation enabled Celtic populations to use democratic processes to support their own cultural institutions and educational programs. The development of democratic political systems provided channels through which Celtic cultural concerns could influence government policies, while also creating new contexts for cultural expression and preservation. The scholarly societies that emerged throughout Celtic territories during the 19th century provided institutional frameworks for systematic cultural preservation and revival efforts, creating organizations that could coordinate research projects, publish scholarly materials, and support educational programs designed to maintain connections to traditional Celtic culture. These societies often combined scholarly research with practical cultural preservation activities, creating sustainable institutional foundations for ongoing cultural work. The international scholarly networks that developed during the 19th century connected Celtic scholars with colleagues throughout Europe and beyond, creating opportunities for comparative research that revealed both the distinctive characteristics of Celtic culture and its connections to broader patterns of European cultural development. These international connections provided resources and support for Celtic cultural preservation, while also ensuring that Celtic materials would contribute to broader scholarly understanding of European cultural history. The museum collections that were assembled during the 19th century preserved material artifacts from Celtic culture, while also creating public contexts for cultural education and appreciation. The systematic collection and display of Celtic archaeological materials, traditional crafts, and historical documents provided opportunities for public engagement with Celtic cultural heritage, while also preserving materials that might otherwise have been lost to private collectors or destroyed through neglect. The publishing industry that developed during the 19th century created new opportunities for the dissemination of Celtic cultural materials through affordable printed editions of traditional texts, scholarly studies, and popular works designed to introduce general audiences to Celtic cultural heritage. The expansion of literacy and the development of mass publishing created unprecedented opportunities for cultural preservation and revival, while also creating new challenges related to the commercialization and popularization of traditional cultural materials. As the 19th century progressed and industrial civilization transformed the social context within which Celtic cultural traditions had survived, new forms of cultural preservation and revival would emerge that combined scholarly research with popular enthusiasm, creating movements that would profoundly influence modern understanding of Celtic heritage, while raising fundamental questions about the relationship between authentic historical tradition and contemporary cultural needs. The 20th century dawned with Celtic cultural revival movements, reaching unprecedented heights of popular enthusiasm and scholarly sophistication. As the convergence of romantic nationalism, archaeological discovery, and emerging anthropological methods created new possibilities for understanding and reconstructing ancient Celtic traditions. The Great War that engulfed Europe from 1914 to 1918 would profoundly disrupt these cultural movements while simultaneously creating new contexts for Celtic identity as young men from Ireland, Wales, Scotland, and Brittany found themselves fighting in foreign trenches, far from the ancient landscapes that had shaped their ancestors' spiritual understanding. The aftermath of global conflict brought both devastation and opportunity to Celtic cultural preservation efforts, as the collapse of old imperial structures created space for new forms of cultural expression, while economic hardship threatened the survival of traditional communities that had maintained connections to ancient practices. The Irish independence movement that culminated in the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922 provided unprecedented political support for Celtic cultural revival, as the new government actively promoted Gaelic language education and traditional cultural practices as essential components of national identity. The scholarly revolution that transformed Celtic studies during the early 20th century brought together archaeologists, linguists, historians, and anthropologists who possessed both advanced technical skills and access to previously unavailable sources. The decipherment of Ogham inscriptions, the systematic excavation of Iron Age sites, and the application of comparative mythology to Celtic literary sources revealed layers of cultural complexity that had been invisible to earlier generations of scholars working with more limited tools and theoretical frameworks. The discovery of major archaeological sites throughout Celtic territories during this period provided material evidence that fundamentally altered understanding of pre-Christian Celtic civilization. The excavations at sites like Hallstatt, Latten, and numerous British hill forts revealed sophisticated material cultures that demonstrated the advanced technological capabilities and complex social organization of ancient Celtic societies, while votive deposits in rivers and ritual shafts provided concrete evidence for religious practices that had previously been known only through literary sources. The development of air photography and other new archaeological techniques enabled the identification of previously unknown ancient sites while revealing the true scale of Celtic settlement and ceremonial activity throughout Europe. The crop marks and earthwork shadows visible from aerial perspectives showed that the Celtic landscape had been far more densely populated and intensively managed than earlier scholars had imagined, suggesting that pre-Roman Celtic civilization had achieved levels of sophistication that rivaled contemporary Mediterranean cultures. The linguistic research that flourished during the early 20th century established Celtic languages as crucial components of the Indo-European language family, while revealing the antiquity and sophistication of Celtic literary traditions. The reconstruction of Proto-Celtic vocabulary and grammar provided new tools for understanding the cultural concepts and social institutions that had characterized ancient Celtic societies. while comparative analysis of Celtic and other Indo-European traditions revealed previously unrecognized connections between Celtic culture and broader patterns of European cultural development. The anthropological approaches that were applied to Celtic cultural materials during this period brought new theoretical frameworks for understanding the social functions of ritual, mythology, and artistic expression within traditional societies. The work of scholars like James Fraser and Mircea Eliade provided comparative context for understanding Celtic religious practices, while functionalist anthropological theory offered new perspectives on the social roles that Druids and other traditional specialists had played within Celtic communities. The folk revival movements that gained momentum throughout Celtic territories during the 1920s and 1930s created new institutional frameworks for preserving traditional music, dance, storytelling, and craft techniques that had survived in rural communities. These movements often combined scholarly research with practical cultural preservation activities, creating sustainable programs that could maintain traditional practices while adapting them to serve contemporary cultural needs. The political upheavals that characterized Europe during the 1930s and 1940s created both threats and opportunities for Celtic cultural preservation. As fascist movements sought to appropriate Celtic symbols and traditions for their own purposes while simultaneously promoting research into ancient European cultures. The misuse of Celtic cultural materials by Nazi ideologists created lasting complications for Celtic studies, as scholars struggled to reclaim their field from political appropriation while maintaining scholarly objectivity and historical accuracy. The Second World War brought unprecedented destruction to European cultural institutions while also creating new opportunities for international scholarly cooperation, as Celtic scholars from different countries found themselves working together in exile or in resistance movements. The shared experience of cultural threat and preservation efforts during wartime created lasting bonds between scholars and cultural activists that would influence Celtic studies throughout the post-war period. The post-war period witnessed explosive growth in Celtic studies as universities throughout Europe and North America established specialized programs, while archaeological excavations resumed with new techniques and theoretical approaches. The development of radiocarbon dating provided precise chronological frameworks for Celtic archaeological materials, while the emergence of environmental archaeology revealed detailed information about ancient Celtic relationships with landscape and natural resources. The discovery of major Celtic manuscript collections in previously inaccessible libraries and archives provided new sources for understanding medieval preservation of ancient traditions, while the application of new analytical techniques to existing manuscripts revealed previously unrecognized layers of textual development and cultural transmission. The systematic cataloging and publication of these materials created unprecedented resources for comparative analysis of Celtic cultural traditions across different regions and time periods. The folk music revival that swept through Celtic territories during the 1950s and 1960s created new popular appreciation for traditional cultural forms, while also raising questions about authenticity and cultural appropriation. The commercial success of Celtic music created economic incentives for cultural preservation, while also transforming traditional practices to meet commercial market demands, creating tensions between authentic cultural transmission and popular entertainment that continue to influence Celtic cultural movements today. The development of television and other mass media created new opportunities for Celtic cultural education and preservation, while also threatening traditional forms of cultural transmission that had depended on direct personal contact between teachers and students. The documentation of traditional practitioners through film and audio recording preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost, while also transforming the nature of cultural transmission by removing it from its original social contexts. The social movements that emerged during the 1960s created new political contexts for Celtic cultural revival as civil rights movements, environmental activism, and countercultural movements found inspiration in Celtic traditions that seemed to offer alternatives to mainstream industrial civilization. The romanticization of Celtic culture that characterized many of these movements often involved historical inaccuracies and cultural appropriation, but also created new audiences for scholarly Celtic studies and practical cultural preservation efforts. The establishment of Celtic departments in major universities throughout Europe and North America during the 1960s and 1970s created institutional foundations for advanced Celtic studies, while also providing career paths for scholars specializing in Celtic languages, literature, history, and archaeology. These academic programs produced new generations of Celtic scholars while also creating institutional contexts for preserving and transmitting specialized knowledge about Celtic cultural traditions. The archaeological discoveries that continued throughout the latter half of the 20th century provided increasingly detailed information about ancient Celtic life, while also revealing the complexity and diversity of Celtic cultural practices across different regions and time periods. The excavation of sites like the Heuneberg in Germany, Bibracte in France, and numerous sites in Britain and Ireland demonstrated that Celtic civilization had been far more sophisticated and varied than earlier scholars had recognized. The development of experimental archaeology during this period created new understanding of ancient Celtic technological capabilities and cultural practices through practical reconstruction of ancient techniques. The recreation of Iron Age farming methods, craft production techniques, and building construction provided insights into Celtic material culture that could not be gained through traditional archaeological analysis alone. The computer revolution that began during the 1980s transformed Celtic studies by enabling sophisticated databases of linguistic and cultural materials, while also creating new possibilities for textual analysis and comparative research. The digitization of Celtic manuscripts and archaeological records made these materials accessible to international scholarly communities, while also preserving them from physical deterioration and loss. The emergence of Celtic spirituality movements during the latter 20th century created new popular interest in ancient Celtic religious traditions, while also raising questions about the relationship between historical accuracy and contemporary spiritual needs. These movements often combined elements from authentic Celtic traditions with modern spiritual practices and philosophical concepts, creating hybrid religious systems that serve contemporary spiritual seekers while claiming connection to ancient wisdom traditions. The genetic research that became possible during the 1990s provided new tools for understanding ancient Celtic population movements and cultural relationships, while also revealing the complexity of European population history and the limitations of simple ethnic categories for understanding ancient cultural relationships. The application of DNA analysis to ancient Celtic remains provided evidence for population continuity and change that complemented archaeological and linguistic evidence, while also raising new questions about the relationship between cultural and biological inheritance. The Internet revolution that transformed global communications during the 1990s created unprecedented opportunities for Celtic cultural preservation and revival, while also facilitating cultural exchange between Celtic communities worldwide. Online databases, digital archives, and virtual communities enabled cultural preservation activities that would have been impossible during earlier periods, while also creating new challenges related to cultural authenticity and quality control. The new millennium brought both continuity and change to Celtic cultural studies, as established scholarly methods continued to produce new discoveries, while emerging technologies created new possibilities for research and cultural preservation. The application of advanced archaeological techniques, sophisticated linguistic analysis, and innovative cultural preservation methods ensured that the ancient legacy of the Druids would continue to influence contemporary understanding of European cultural development and human spiritual seeking. As we move deeper into the 21st century, the streams of ancient Celtic wisdom continue to flow through diverse channels of scholarly research, cultural preservation, and spiritual seeking, ensuring that the profound insights developed within the sacred groves of ancient Europe will continue to offer guidance and inspiration for future generations. facing their own challenges of cultural preservation and spiritual understanding in an ever-changing world. The digital age that emerged in the early 21st century brought unprecedented tools for Celtic scholarship while simultaneously raising profound questions about the authenticity and transmission of ancient wisdom in virtual environments. The massive digitization projects undertaken by libraries and museums worldwide created searchable databases containing millions of pages of Celtic manuscripts, archaeological reports, and ethnographic recordings that had previously been accessible only to specialized scholars working in specific institutions. The sophisticated search algorithms and cross-referencing capabilities of these digital archives revealed previously unrecognized patterns and connections within Celtic cultural materials, enabling scholars to trace the transmission of specific stories, legal concepts, and ritual practices across vast geographical distances and temporal spans. The ability to compare multiple manuscript versions of the same text simultaneously revealed layers of editorial modification and cultural adaptation that demonstrated how Celtic traditions had evolved through centuries of copying and reinterpretation. The emergence of social media platforms created new communities of Celtic cultural enthusiasts who could share information, coordinate preservation efforts, and maintain cultural connections across continents in ways that would have been impossible for previous generations. These online networks enabled Celtic language learners in remote locations to connect with native speakers, traditional craftspeople, to share techniques with apprentices worldwide, and scholars to collaborate on research projects without regard to institutional or geographical boundaries. The crowdsourcing capabilities enabled by internet technologies revolutionized Celtic cultural preservation by allowing large numbers of volunteers to contribute to digitization projects, transcription efforts, and cultural documentation initiatives. Community members could photograph ancient stones, record elderly storytellers, and document traditional practices using smartphones and digital cameras, creating vast archives of cultural materials that supplemented formal academic research with grassroots preservation efforts. The three-dimensional scanning technologies that became available during this period enabled unprecedented documentation of Celtic archaeological sites and artifacts, creating virtual models that preserved precise spatial relationships and surface details that traditional photography and drawing could not capture. These digital reconstructions allowed scholars to study fragile artifacts without handling original materials, while also creating educational resources that could transport students virtually to ancient Celtic sites and ceremonial spaces. The genetic genealogy revolution that accompanied advances in DNA analysis provided new tools for understanding ancient Celtic population movements and cultural transmission patterns, while also enabling modern individuals to trace their own ancestral connections to ancient Celtic communities. The combination of genetic data with historical and archaeological evidence created more nuanced understanding of how cultural practices spread through ancient Europe and how modern Celtic populations relate to their prehistoric ancestors. The climate change research that intensified during this period revealed how environmental transformations had influenced ancient Celtic cultural development, while also raising urgent questions about the preservation of Celtic archaeological sites threatened by rising sea levels, coastal erosion, and extreme weather events. The recognition that many important Celtic sites faced imminent destruction from environmental change created new urgency around documentation and preservation efforts. The virtual reality technologies that emerged during the 2010s created immersive experiences that could transport users into reconstructed ancient Celtic environments, allowing them to walk through recreated hill forts, participate in virtual seasonal festivals, and observe demonstrations of traditional craft techniques. These technologies provided powerful educational tools, while also raising questions about the accuracy of historical reconstructions and the potential for virtual experiences to replace direct engagement with authentic cultural practices. The artificial intelligence systems that began appearing during this period offered new possibilities for analysing vast quantities of Celtic cultural materials, identifying patterns that human scholars might miss, while also automating certain types of linguistic analysis and textual comparison. Machine learning algorithms trained on Celtic language materials could assist with translation projects and manuscript analysis, though questions remained about the ability of artificial intelligence to understand the cultural contexts and spiritual dimensions that gave meaning to ancient Celtic traditions. The blockchain technologies that emerged during the 2010s provided new methods for verifying the authenticity and provenance of Celtic cultural materials in digital environments, creating permanent records of ownership and modification that could prevent unauthorized alteration of traditional texts and cultural resources. These technologies offered potential solutions to long-standing problems of cultural appropriation and misrepresentation, while also creating new possibilities for community-controlled cultural preservation initiatives. The mobile applications developed for Celtic language learning and cultural education brought traditional knowledge to global audiences through smartphones and tablets, making Celtic cultural materials accessible to individuals who lacked access to formal educational institutions or traditional cultural communities. These apps combine traditional pedagogical methods with modern interactive technologies, creating learning experiences that could adapt to individual needs while maintaining connections to authentic cultural transmission methods. The podcast revolution that transformed media consumption during this period created new platforms for Celtic cultural education and storytelling, enabling traditional practitioners to reach global audiences while maintaining the oral character that had always been central to Celtic cultural transmission. These audio programs preserved the cadences and performance aspects of traditional Celtic storytelling while adapting ancient narratives to serve contemporary audience needs and technological capabilities. The maker movement that flourished during this period inspired new interest in traditional Celtic craft techniques, as individuals sought alternatives to mass-produced goods while reconnecting with ancestral skills and cultural practices. The combination of traditional Celtic metalworking, woodworking and textile techniques with modern tools and materials created hybrid practices that honoured ancient traditions while serving contemporary functional and aesthetic needs. The environmental movement that gained momentum during the early 21st century found inspiration in Celtic cultural traditions that emphasized sacred relationships between human communities and natural landscapes, leading to increased interest in Celtic environmental wisdom and traditional ecological knowledge. The recognition that ancient Celtic practices had often maintained sustainable relationships with natural resources created new appreciation for traditional Celtic approaches to land management and resource use. The wellness industries that emerged during this period incorporated elements from Celtic healing traditions, though often in simplified or commercialized forms that bore little resemblance to the complex cultural contexts within which these practices had originally developed. The popularity of Celtic-inspired meditation practices, herbal remedies, and seasonal celebrations demonstrated widespread hunger for spiritual alternatives to mainstream consumer culture, while also raising questions about cultural appropriation and authentic transmission. The climate activism that intensified during this period often drew inspiration from Celtic cultural traditions that emphasized the sacred character of natural landscapes and the responsibilities of human communities to maintain harmonious relationships with the living world. The protests against pipeline construction, mining operations, and industrial development in Celtic territories often incorporated traditional ceremonial elements and invoked ancient concepts about the spiritual significance of threatened landscapes. The educational reforms that occurred in Celtic territories during this period increasingly incorporated traditional knowledge and cultural practices into formal curricula, recognizing the value of indigenous wisdom for addressing contemporary challenges, while also acknowledging historical injustices that had suppressed Celtic cultural expression. The development of immersive Celtic language programs and culturally responsive pedagogical approaches created new possibilities for maintaining living connections to ancient traditions. The tourism industries that developed around Celtic cultural heritage sites created economic incentives for cultural preservation while also raising concerns about commercialization and the transformation of sacred sites into entertainment venues. The challenge of balancing economic development with cultural authenticity and environmental protection became increasingly urgent as global tourism expanded and climate change threatened fragile archaeological sites. The psychological research that emerged during this period revealed the mental health benefits that many individuals derived from engagement with Celtic cultural practices, particularly those involving connection to natural environments, seasonal rhythms, and community-based activities. The recognition that traditional Celtic practices could address contemporary problems of isolation, anxiety, and disconnection from natural cycles created new appreciation for ancient wisdom, while also raising questions about appropriate adaptation and cultural sensitivity. And so, our journey through the mists of time draws to a close, yet like the ancient Celtic understanding of existence itself, endings are merely transformations leading to new beginnings. From the sacred groves of Bronze Age Europe to the digital archives of the 21st century, the wisdom of the Druids continues to flow like underground streams, sometimes hidden but never truly lost, always ready to nourish those who seek connection to deeper truths about our place in the great wheel of existence that turns forever between earth and sky.